Carl Jung lay on his deathbed when he finally understood what he had spent his entire life trying to tell. It wasn't words that mattered, symbols. It was the silences between words, suspended moments where consciousness and conscious touch, where the reality crumbles for just an instant, the truth that had always been there. Jung opened his eyes that last day and whispered to his assistant, "So much left to say." But perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps everything had already been said. Perhaps the problem was that no one was really listening. Because the truth that Jung discovered over 8 decades of research, dream analysis, dives into the depths of the human psyche, is a truth so simple and so devastating that most people pass by it every day without ever truly seeing it. You are asleep. Not now, but for most of your life, you are asleep. And the worst part is that you don't even know. Think about what you do every day. You wake up because the alarm rings, not because your body truly wants to wake up. You follow a routine you didn't choose, designed by other people, and other times serve purposes that aren't yours. You work a job you may not love, for money that may not satisfy you, to buy things you may not need. You consume information without questioning, believe narratives, follow commands you don't understand. You move through life like an actor in a play you didn't choose to be, reciting lines you didn't write, wearing a mask that isn't your face. And then you go home, tired, exhausted, and sleep 8 hours. You sleep deeply, unconsciously, disconnected. You sleep without purpose, without intention, without ever questioning why you're sleeping. Jung called this collective numbness. It wasn't a disease. It was psychic anesthesia. It was all of humanity asleep in their own bodies, living lives that weren't theirs, thinking thoughts that weren't, dreaming dreams. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that most people die without ever waking up. Here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. While you sleep 8, 9, 10 hours a night in unconscious slumber, there is another you. It's not an illusion, not a metaphor. It's as real as your body, real as the air you breathe. Jung called this other you, the self. The totality of your psyche, the higher instance of consciousness that contains all the wisdom you will ever need. And this self never sleeps. While your body rests, while your conscious mind, the one that has been domesticated by society, completely shuts down, your self remains awake, working, creating, weaving symbols, processing traumas you pretended didn't exist, connecting dots your conscious mind could never see. It's whispering messages to you, trying to communicate, trying to awaken you to who you really are. But you can't hear it because you're asleep. You're asleep while it screams. You're asleep while it tries to save your life. Jung spent 50 years studying dreams, not as a hobby, not out of academic curiosity, because he understood that dreams are not random brain noise. They are letters for self. They are encrypted messages in symbolic language, in archetypes, and images that contain truths that your conscious mind could never articulate. Each dream is a sacred encounter between who you pretended to be and who you really are. Each dream is an opportunity to awaken. But most people wake up, forget the dream in 5 minutes, and go on with their day. They continue sleeping. They continue living the life they didn't choose. And Jung saw this happen hundreds, thousands of times. He saw people wasting a third of their lives sleeping aimlessly without ever trying to understand what their unconscious was trying. He saw entire lives pass by without the person ever truly waking up. And then Jung made a discovery that deeply disturbed him. He realized that there is a direct, almost mathematical correlation between sleeping less and waking up. It's not about pathological sleep deprivation, not about torture. It's about transforming your relationship. It's about stopping passive sleep and starting intentional sleep. It's about reducing unconscious dormancy time and increasing active consciousness time, especially during that mysterious state between sleep and wakefulness, where the self can communicate with crystal clarity. Jung called this state the hypnagogic state. It is in this state that the greatest revelations happen. It is in this state that you can finally hear the voice of your true self. But most people pass through this state while sleeping without ever truly crossing it. They go through it every day, twice a day throughout their lives, without ever knowing they were passing through a sacred portal. Now, you might be thinking this is madness, that it's pseudoscience, just some old psychologist spouting strange things. But Jung was no ordinary man. He was a man who had delved so deeply into the mysteries of the human psyche that he had touched upon something that transcends rational understanding. He had seen things that conventional science still cannot explain, documented transformations that defy logic. He had worked with people who, when they began to work with their dreams, when they began to reduce their passive sleep time, increase their active consciousness time, had their lives completely transformed. People who discovered their true purposes, people who resolved conflicts they had carried for decades, people who finally awakened to themselves. And the question Jung leaves us with is simple but devastating. Are you ready to wake up? Because the truth is, you can continue sleeping. You can continue living a life you didn't choose, thinking thoughts you didn't generate, being someone you're not. No one will force you to wake up. There is a call. There is a whisper from the self that says, wake up now, wake up to who you truly are. And the question is, will you heed that call, or will you continue sleeping until the day you close your eyes for the last? Do you know that feeling when you wake up in the morning and can't remember what you dreamed? You know you dreamed about something important, something that mattered. But when you try to grasp the image, it vanishes like smoke through your fingers. You lie there in bed, trying to recover that golden thread. It's gone. And then you get up, have coffee, go to work, and completely forget that you were trying to remember anything. Jung observed this in thousands of people. He observed this daily loss of crucial messages, of communications from the self that arrived every night and were discarded in the morning like garbage. He realized something disturbing. This wasn't just a memory lapse. It was a symptom of much deeper numbness. It was living proof that you were sleeping not only at night, but throughout the entire day as well. Think about your life right now. Really think about it. You wake up because you have to, not because you want to. You get ready because you're expected to. You go to work because you need the money, not because that job feeds your soul. You sit in a chair for 8 hours, do things that maybe mean nothing to you, talk to people who maybe don't understand you, and follow scripts that other people wrote. You eat lunch quickly because you don't have time. You come home tired. You take time for your family, but you're thinking about work. You watch television or scroll through social media, consuming information you didn't ask for, believing narratives you never verified. And then you go to sleep soundly, and the next day you wake up and do it all again. Day after day, week after week, you're living a life that was designed for you, not a life you designed for yourself. Jung called this living someone else's, and most people do exactly that. He spends his entire life living the life his parents expected him to live, the life society expected him to live, the life culture expected him to live. Never his own life. Never. And here's the point Jung wanted you to understand. While you're living someone else's life during the day, yourself is screaming through your... It's desperately trying to communicate with you, trying to tell you that this isn't who you are. This isn't what you can. That there's something much greater waiting for you. You have the courage to wait, but you can't hear it because you're asleep. You're asleep while it screams. And the tragedy is that you think you're awake. You think you're living. You think you're making choices. But Jung knew the truth. He knew you were operating on autopilot, following a program that had been installed in you since childhood. He knew you were an actor in a play you didn't choose, reciting lines you didn't write, wearing a mask that wasn't your face. Jung observed something even more disturbing in his patients. He observed that the more time you spend living someone else's life, the deeper you fall asleep. The further you drift from who you truly are, the more you forget that there is a self within you, a totality, a fullness that is being suffocated by expectations of others. He observed people who came to his office in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and said, "Dr. Jung, I feel I'm living the wrong life. I feel I've lost something important, but I can't remember what it is." And Jung knew exactly what they had lost. They had lost themselves. They had spent decades asleep, living lives that weren't theirs. And now they were waking up to the devastating reality that perhaps it was too late. Perhaps there was no more time. Perhaps life had passed them by while they slept. But Jung also discovered something that offered hope. He discovered that this dormancy, however deep, was not irreversible. He discovered that even people who had slept for decades could still wake up. They could still reconnect with the self. They could still begin to live their own. But there was a price. There was always a price. The price was being willing to question everything. The price was being willing to lose the security of the life you knew, even if that life was... The price was being willing to listen to the voices of your unconscious, even if those voices said things you didn't want to. The price was being willing to do the inner work that no one sees, that work that is done in the shadows, in that space between sleep and wakefulness, where the self can finally communicate. And here's what Jung wanted you to know. You are passing through that sacred space twice a day. Every night when you sleep, you enter it. Every morning when you wake up, you are passing through a portal where the self could communicate with you, could reveal truths, could awaken you to who you really are. Pass through it while sleeping. You pass through it without ever really being. And while you pass through it while sleeping, the self is desperately trying to reach you, is trying to leave messages, is trying to save you from dormancy. But you can't hear it. You can't see it. You can't feel it because you are sleeping. And Jung realized that the solution wasn't to sleep more. The solution was to sleep less, but with intention. The solution was to transform that sacred space between sleep and wakefulness into a place where you were truly present, truly awake, truly listening to what the self had to say. Because when you do that, when you start working with that state, when you begin to reduce the time of unconscious dormancy and increase the time of active consciousness at that mysterious threshold, something extraordinary happens. You begin to wake up. Truly wake up, and your life is never the same again. There's a number Jung never forgot. 30 years. That's the amount of time a person sleeps in a 100-year life. 30 years completely unconscious, completely disconnected, completely absent. Jung spent hours contemplating this number, 30 years, an entire generation of lost time, and he began to ask a question no one had asked before. What if those 30 years weren't? What if they were actually a wasted opportunity? A conversation that never happened, a life that was never lived. Because while you sleep those 30 years, your unconscious isn't sleeping. Your unconscious is working. It's processing, it's creating, it's weaving symbols that contain answers to the deepest questions of it's connecting points that your conscious mind, the one domesticated by linear logic, could never connect. It's guarding messages, secrets, revelations that could completely transform how you understand yourself and the world. Jung discovered something that deeply disturbed the scientific community of his time. He discovered that the unconscious is not a psychological garbage dump, as Freud had suggested. It is an ocean of wisdom. It is a living archive of all human experience, of all archetypes, of all symbols that humanity has ever created. Jung called this the collective unconscious. It is not your personal unconscious, the one that contains your individual traumas, your memories, your secrets, something much larger. It is the unconscious shared by all of humanity. It's as if there were a universal library inside you, a library that contains all the wisdom that humanity has ever accumulated, and you have access to it every night when you sleep. But you don't know, you don't know. You sleep without ever really entering that life. You walk through the door every night and leave every morning without ever having really been there. You're wasting 30 years of access to wisdom that could transform your life. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Jung discovered that the more you sleep aimlessly, without trying to understand what your unconscious is trying to tell you, the more you remain trapped in patterns, the more you repeat cycles, the more you live the same life over and over again with different variations, essentially the same. You know that feeling of déjà vu? That feeling that you've lived it before. You knew why. He knew you were repeating patterns that your unconscious was desperately trying to make you understand. It was trying to wake you up to the pattern, to the lesson, to the message it was trying to convey. But you couldn't see it because you were asleep. You were asleep while the unconscious screamed. You were asleep while it tried to save you from a life of repetition. Then Jung made an observation that changed everything. He observed that people who began to actively work with their dreams, who began to wake up in the middle of the night and write down what they had dreamed, who began to meditate on the symbols that emerged from their dreams, these people began to break the patterns. They began to see the lessons. They began to understand the messages. And when they understood, when they truly integrated these messages, something extraordinary happened. The patterns dissolved. The cycles broke. Life changed. Not gradually, drastically, as if a blindfold had been lifted from their eyes, as if you had woken up from a dream and realized what you believed to be real was just an illusion. But for this to happen, you had to be willing to do. You had to be willing to reduce the time of unconscious dormancy. You had to be willing to increase the time of active consciousness in that space between sleep and wakefulness. You had to be willing to listen to the voices of your unconscious, even if those voices said things you didn't want to hear. Now here is the revelation that Jung treasured. He discovered that there is a direct correlation between the amount of time you spend consciously in that hypnagogic state and the speed at which you break patterns. The more time you spend there, truly present, truly awake, truly listening, the faster you transform, the faster you become who you truly are. And the way to increase that time is not by sleeping more, not less randomly, consciously, less intentionally, less purposefully. Because when you reduce the time of unconscious dormancy, you are forcing your body and mind to remain longer on that sacred threshold. You are creating more opportunities for the self to communicate with you. You are opening more portals. You're creating more channels of communication between consciousness and the unconscious. In that space, that mysterious threshold, that true transformation happened. Jung documented hundreds of cases of people who did exactly that. People who reduced their sleep time from 8 hours to 6 or 7 hours, but did so with complete intention. People who established bedtime rituals, who set clear intentions, who prepared themselves to receive messages from the conscious. People who woke up in the middle of the night and immediately wrote down their dreams. Without thinking, without filtering, simply transcribing the symbolic language that emerged from people who meditated on these symbols during the day, who sought to understand the archetypes, who listened attentively to what the unconscious was trying to say. And do you know what happened to these people? They woke up. They truly woke up. They didn't just open their eyes in the morning. They woke up to themselves. They woke up to who they really were. They woke up to the purpose they had come to fulfill. And when that happened, their lives changed completely. Not because external circumstances changed, but because they changed. Because they became who they were always destined to be. Because they finally heard the voice of the self and had the courage to follow that voice, even if it meant leaving behind everything they knew. But Jung also knew something most people don't want to hear. He knew that to do this, truly awaken, you had to be willing to lose things. You had to be willing to leave behind relationships that didn't serve you. You had to be willing to abandon careers that didn't nourish your soul. You had to be willing to question beliefs you'd carried your whole life. You had to be willing to become someone completely different. And that's scary. That's terrifying. Because the unknown is always scarier than the prison. But Jung knew that it was precisely this fear that kept people asleep. It was precisely this fear that prevented them from doing work. It was precisely this fear that condemned them to a life of dormancy, repetition, of patterns that never. And the question he left for each person was simple. What is the price of continuing to sleep? What is the cost of spending 30 years unconscious? What is the price of living a life that isn't yours? Because perhaps waking up is scary, but continuing to sleep is much scarier still. Jung had a patient he never forgot. A 52-year-old man, successful executive, married, with children, with everything society said you should have to be happy. But this man woke up every night at 3 in the morning with pain in his chest. He woke up sweating, trembling. He sought out cardiologists, neurologists. No one found anything. His heart was perfect. His brain was perfect. Everything was perfect. He kept waking up at 3 in the morning with that feeling of impending death. And he sought out Jung. Jung listened to him tell his story, heard about his perfect life, his perfect career, his perfect family. And then Jung asked something no one had ever asked before. The man remained silent. He remained silent for so long that Jung thought he hadn't heard the question. But he had heard it. He simply couldn't answer. Because the truth was that he wasn't happy. The truth was that he hated his job. The truth was that he didn't love his work. The truth was he didn't recognize himself when he looked in the mirror. The truth was he was living someone else's life. And his subconscious, the one that never sleeps, the one that knows the truth, was screaming for him to wake. It was screaming so loudly that it was waking him up every night at 3 in the morning. Jung began working with that, not with medication, not with conventional techniques, dreams. He asked him to wake up at 3 in the morning and immediately write down what he asked him to meditate on these dreams during the day. Asked him to reduce his sleep time from 8 hours to 6 hours, but to do so with total intention. Asked him to establish a dialogue with his unconscious before sleeping. Ask what the unconscious wanted him to understand. And then something extraordinary began. The dreams began to reveal things. They began to show symbols. They began to tell a story. The story of a man who had died at 25, who had left his dreams behind, who had accepted the life his parents expected him to live. And now, at 52, that man who had died was desperately trying to communicate with the man who was living. He was trying to say, wake up. Wake up before it's too late. Wake up to who you really are. And when that executive understood this, when he truly internalized that message, did something most people would never have the courage to do. He quit his job. He left his wife. He left his life. And he started living. He started painting, something he had always wanted. He started traveling, something he had dreamed of doing. He started being who he truly was. And you know what happened? That 3 o'clock panic disappeared completely. It never came back. This was not an isolated. Jung had hundreds of them. He had stories of people who woke up when they began to reduce the time of unconscious dormancy and increase the time of active consciousness in that hypnagogic state. He had stories of women who discovered they were living lives they didn't want. He had stories of men who realized they had wasted decades pursuing goals that weren't theirs. He had stories of people who, when they began to listen to the voice of the self, when they began to understand the messages of the unconscious, made radical changes in their lives. And the most surprising thing was that these changes didn't leave them more tired. They left them more alive, more energized, more present. Because when you stop fighting against the self, when you stop ignoring the messages of when you finally begin to live you discover an energy you never knew you, an energy that comes from being aligned with who you truly are. Jung documented something that modern science is still trying to understand. He documented that when you intentionally work with the hypnagogic state, when you reduce the time of unconscious sleep, your body actually rests more deeply. Not because you're sleeping more, but because you're sleeping. Because the sleep you're having, quality sleep, body and mind truly restoring themselves. The self can do the work. Jung observed that people who did this reported waking up more rested after 6 hours of intentional sleep than after 10 hours of passive sleep. They reported mental clarity that penetrated the veils of illusion. They reported creativity that sprang from deep sources. They reported a feeling of finally being awake, of finally being alive. And all this because they had reduced the time of unconscious sleep and increased the time of active consciousness on that sacred threshold between sleep and wakefulness. But Jung also discovered something even more disturbing. He discovered that there is a specific state within that hypnagogic state where you can receive direct communications from the self. He called it the hypnagogic vision. It's a state where you are between sleep and wakefulness, where rational logic completely disappears, where you come into contact with the pure language of the unconscious, with archetypes, universal wisdom. And in that state, when you are truly present, truly awake, truly listening, the self can communicate with clarity that is impossible at any other time. It can reveal truths about who you are, about what you came to do, about what your true purpose is. Jung had documentation of people who, in that state, had visions that completely transformed how they understood their lives. Visions that answered questions they had carried for decades. Visions that revealed the path they needed to follow. And all this because they had learned to be present in that space, be awake on that threshold, to listen to the voice of the self. Now, you might be thinking that this is impossible, that it's fantasy, that it's just an old psychologist talking about things that can't be measured or proven. But Jung wasn't a man who talked about things he couldn't prove. He was a man who had spent 80 years studying the human psyche, who had documented thousands of cases, who had developed techniques that worked. And he left behind a legacy of transformed people. He left behind stories of lives that were saved. He left behind evidence that when you start working with your dreams, when you start reducing the time of unconscious dormancy, when you start being present in that hypnagogic state, something extraordinary happens. You wake up. You really wake up. And your life is never the same again. Because now you're listening to the voice of the self. Now you're following the voice of the life that the self always knew you should live. And it is at that moment, at that exact moment when you finally hear that voice, that you understand that you were never really sleeping. You were just waiting to wake up. You might be thinking that reducing your sleep time will leave you exhausted, sick, unable to function. That society doesn't allow you to sleep late. Your job demands you be in perfect condition. You have responsibilities, commitments, people depending on you. And you're right. You're correct. If you simply cut sleep hours without knowing what you're doing, without intention, without purpose, you'll get tired, you'll get sick, you'll fall apart. But Jung wasn't suggesting you torture yourself. He wasn't suggesting you ignore your body's basic needs. He was suggesting something much more radical and much more intelligent. He was suggesting you completely transform your relationship with sleep. That you stop sleeping passively and start sleeping actively. That you stop sleeping without purpose and start sleeping with sacred intention. Because when you do that, when you really do that, something extraordinary happens. You discover you need less sleep than you thought. You discover you can live more fully with less drowsiness. You discover that sleep quality is infinitely more important than quantity. Think about how you sleep now. You go to bed when you're tired or bedtime. You don't think about anything. You don't set any intention. You don't prepare. You simply lie down and sleep. And then you wake up 8 hours later, still tired, still empty, still asleep. Now imagine something different. Imagine that before you sleep, you set a clear intention. You sit, you breathe, you say to yourself, I will reduce my unconscious sleep. I will increase my active conscious time. I will be present in that space between sleep and wakefulness. I will listen to the voice of myself. I will receive the messages that my unconscious has to give me. You do this with total sincerity, total conviction, and then you sleep. Now, you are sleeping with purpose. Now, you're sleeping with intention. Now, you're sleeping actively, not passively. You wake up, you don't wake up tired. You wake up rested. You wake up present. You wake up with clarity. Because your body rested deeply. Because your self was able to do the work it needed to do. Because you were truly there, truly present, truly participating in the process. Jung observed something that deeply disturbed conventional medicine. He observed that when you intentionally work with your sleep, when you reduce the time of unconscious dormancy, your body actually recovers better. Not because you're sleeping more, but because you're sleeping differently. Because the sleep you are having is a sleep where the body is completely relaxed, where the mind is completely open, where the self is able to do the restoration it needs. Jung documented that people who did this reported waking up more rested after 6 hours of intentional sleep than after 10 hours of passive sleep. They reported higher energy levels during the day. They reported mental clarity that penetrated the veils of illusion. They reported creativity that sprang from sources they never knew existed. And most importantly, they reported a feeling of finally being alive, finally being awake, of finally being who they truly are. Because when you stop fighting the self, when you stop ignoring the messages of the unconscious, when you finally begin to live your own life, discover an energy you never knew you had. Here's the critical point Jung wanted you to understand. He knew most people wouldn't do it. He knew most people would stay asleep. He knew most people would be afraid to do the work. He knew most people would prefer to stay asleep rather than wake up to the reality of their lives. And he knew why. He knew waking up is terrifying. Waking up means seeing the truth. Waking up means understanding you've wasted years living a life that wasn't yours. Waking up means having to make changes. Waking up means having to leave behind things you know, even if those things don't serve you. Waking up means having to become someone completely different. And that's terrifying. That's absolutely terrifying. Because the unknown is always scarier than the... But Jung also knew something most people don't want to hear. He knew the price of staying asleep is far greater than the price of waking. He knew that when you die, when you finally close your eyes for the last time, you won't regret waking up. You'll regret sleeping in. Jung had a saying he repeated to all his patients. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about that for a moment. Until you make the unconscious, until you hear the voice of the self, until you understand the messages your unconscious is trying to give you, until you work with your dreams, until you are present in that hypnagogic state, until you truly wake up, you will be living a life you didn't choose. You will be following a path you didn't design. You will be being someone you are not. And you will call it fate. You will call it destiny. You will call it destiny. But it isn't. It's just numbness. It's just the unconscious. Just you sleeping while the self screams. And the question Jung leaves you with now is simple. Will you continue sleeping, or are you ready to wake up? Because the answer to that question will determine the rest of your life. It will determine whether you live your own life or someone else's. It will determine whether you become who you truly are or who you pretended to be. It will determine whether you wake up before it's too late or die in your sleep. Jung knew that this was the most important question you could ask yourself, and he knew that most people wouldn't answer it. They would continue sleeping. They would continue living lives that weren't their own. They would continue ignoring the cries of the self. They would continue wasting 30 years of unconscious dormancy. But he also knew that there were some people who would wake up. There were some people who would have the courage to do the work. There were some people who would be willing to reduce the time of unconscious dormancy and increase the time of active consciousness. There were some people who would be willing to listen to the voice of the self and follow that voice, even if it meant leaving behind everything they knew. And for those people, for those courageous people, Jung left a gift that you receive, a gift that will transform your life. Because now you know the truth. Now you know that you're sleeping. Now you know that there is a self within you that never sleeps. Now you know that there is a way to wake. And the question is, will you have the courage to follow? Here is the challenge. Here is the invitation Jung leaves for you. It's not an invitation to think about waking. It's not an invitation to read more about. It's an invitation to do. Act. Start today. This week you will reduce your sleep time by 1 hour, not out of negligence, not by chance, but of sacred intention. You will sleep 1 hour less, but you will sleep with purpose. You will sleep actively, not passively. And here's exactly how you will do it. Before going to sleep, you will sit for 5 minutes. You will breathe deeply. You will place your hand on your chest and you will say to yourself, with total sincerity, with total conviction, I will reduce my time of unconscious dormancy. I will increase my time of active consciousness. I will be present in that space between sleep and wakefulness. I will listen to the voice of myself. I will receive the messages that my unconscious has to give me. I will awaken to who I truly am. You will say this not as an empty affirmation. You will say this as a promise, as a commitment, like a pact with yourself, and then you go to sleep. You go to sleep with intent. You go to sleep knowing that you are doing something important, something sacred, something that can transform your life. When you wake up immediately, in the first few seconds before thinking about anything, you will grab a piece of paper and a pen. You will write down your dream. Don't think, don't analyze, don't judge. Write down everything you remember, even if it's just fragments, even if it's just images, even if it's just feelings. Write down the symbolic language that emerged from the depths of your... Because what you're writing is a message from yourself. It's a letter that your unconscious is sending you. It's a communication that may contain answers to the most important questions in your life. Don't discard it. Don't ignore it. Write it down. And then during the day, set aside time to meditate. Symbols. Set aside time to listen to what you're unconscious. You don't need much time. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, just enough time to truly be present with just enough time to let the self communicate, just enough time to begin to awake. Do this for a week. Reduce your sleep by 1 hour. Do it with total intention. Work with your dreams. Meditate on the symbols. Listen to the voice of your subconscious and observe what happens. Observe how you feel. Observe if you don't feel more rested with less sleep than you ever felt sleeping 10 hours unconsciously. Observe if you don't feel more alive, more present, more authentic. Observe if you don't begin to see patterns in your life seen before. Observe if you don't begin to understand messages that your subconscious has been trying to give you for years. Observe if you don't begin to wake up. Because when you do this, when you truly do this, you discover something that changes everything. You discover that you were never really sleeping. You were just waiting to wake up. You were just waiting for someone to have the courage to tell the truth. You were just waiting for someone to have the courage to show you the way. And here's the most important thing. When you begin to awaken, you begin to understand the messages of your conscious. When you begin to hear the voice of the self, things in your life may begin to change. Relationships may end. Careers may change. You may begin to question beliefs you've carried your whole life. You may begin to make choices that other people don't understand. You may begin to become someone completely different. And that's scary. That's terrifying. But Jung wanted you to know something. He wanted you to know that this fear is precisely the sign you're on the right path. He wanted you to know that when you begin to awaken, begin to live your own life, when you begin to be who you truly are, you will face resistance. Resistance from people who want you to sleep. Resistance from a society that profits from your dormancy. Resistance from your own ego, which is afraid to die so that the self can be born. But Jung also wanted you to know that this resistance is temporary, because when you keep doing the work, when you keep listening to the voice of the self, when you keep living your own life, that resistance dissolves, and what remains is peace. It's authenticity. It's a feeling of finally being at home within yourself. The truth that Carl Jung proved over 80 years of research is that sleeping less can mean waking up more, but only if you have the courage to do the work. Only if you're willing to listen to the voices of your unconscious. Only if you truly want. Because transformation isn't magic. It's not instantaneous process. Work. It's a journey, but it's a journey worth taking. It's a journey that can save your life. It's a journey that can make you become who you were always meant to. So the question Jung leaves you with now is this: will you continue sleeping, or are you ready to wake up? Because your true awakening began now. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, at this very moment. When you close this video and decide to do the work, when you decide to reduce your sleep by 1 hour, when you decide to set an intention, when you decide to listen to the voice of yourself, when you decide to live your own life, when you decide to wake up, if this video touched something within you, if you felt that call from the self, if you feel it's time to wake up, leave a comment. Leave a comment saying what your true self is. One society has tried to lull to sleep. Leave an anonymous comment if you need. Leave a comment saying what the first step you will take to wake up is. Because when you share this, when you put it into words, when you make your commitment to waking up public, something changes. You create responsibility. You create intention. You create a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, and that bridge is sacred. Subscribe to the channel for more wisdom that the dominant culture doesn't want you to discover. For more truths that society doesn't want you to. For more invitations to wake up. Because there is so much more to reveal. There is so much more to explore. There is so much more to awaken within. And click like if you believe it's time to wake up to your own life. If you believe it's time to stop sleeping and start living. If you believe it's time to listen to the voice of yourself and follow that voice, even if it means leaving behind it. Because when you click that like button, you're saying yes. And yes, you're saying yes to saying yes to the life possible. Your true awakening destination. It's an eternal calling. Calling be now. In to wake up now.